Today our topic is ethics of belief, and we have the wonderful Dr. Earl here to present that for us. And before we begin, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping just to make sure that your cell phones are on silent. And also, if you can't stay the whole hour, we just ask that you should probably leave now instead of getting up and leaving in the middle of the presentation. Okay? But I guess here's Dr. Earl, and he's going to begin on the ethics of belief. Thank you.
So thanks to Tara, thank you to Sarah for organizing all of this, and to everyone else who I don't happen to know just yet who's behind the scenes. I appreciate it very much. And thanks to everybody who's showed up. That is cool. And I see a few of my students here too, and I wanted to thank them also because they suffered, well, maybe they didn't suffer, but they suffered through a dry run of at least some of this material back on Monday, because the very topic of the ethics of belief, I use that in my intro class often enough, and lots of people do, not in a philosophy religion section of the course, but just up front as far as part of a general kind of argument about being rational and what's supposed to be so great about that and so on, which philosophy is supposed to be about. What I'm planning to do here, I guess you kind of know that something interactive is in order because of the gentle instruction at the top. I hope everyone has a red and a green piece of paper. Everybody good on that? All right. I guess you could vote twice, but try to have at least one of those. If you think everything is ethical, you'll want just the green one, because that's going to be green for good, green for ethical, if I ask you just what you think. And then red, that's going to be unethical, as you might imagine. Right? I debated about whether to have a yellow card, so I don't know, but then anything controversial, I'll just see a big sea of yellow out there, and that won't do anyone any good. All right? So the ethics of belief is the topic. That might come across as sort of a little unusual to you at first, and that's okay, because you might think, all right, well, ethics has to do with actions, right? We could morally blame what somebody does, right? That was morally wrong to do, or yes, that was morally good to do. Or we might say that ethics involves people, right? What kind of person should you be, right? That's a morally good person, or that's a morally bad person, and so on. And so you might think, well, what about belief? I didn't know that ethics could have anything to do with believing things. And I guess the case to be made here is that it does, all right? You might be friendly already to the idea that there are some things that may or may not be believed by people that they ought not to believe for various reasons. You might think there are lots of things that people believe where it's morally acceptable that they believe those things, right? Good for them. Or you might have a view that maybe ethics doesn't apply to belief in one way or another, and one way I can think that might come about, and it's okay, but one way that might come about is you might think, well, look, this is America after all, right? This is a free country. You're free to do lots of things. Free thinking is encouraged. Nobody gets punished for thinking bad thoughts, right? I dare you, have a bad thought right now. Ooh, neat, somebody did, right? Somebody had a bad thought, right? It's okay, right? This is America. You can think whatever you want, right? And you might say, by extension, right? And say, all right, well, not only that, it's a free country as far as belief is concerned too, right? Because if you're free to think about various things, you're free to believe whatever you want. Nobody's going to get punished for believing that the world is flat or something like that. It's not like that's illegal. Okay, and that's supposed to be a good thing. And if that is good, if we're supposed to be tolerant of lots and lots of different kinds of beliefs, you might say, well, what's up with you saying that there's such a thing as the ethics of belief after all? All right? Well, let's see. All right? My goal is to sort of search around and fail for a general principle that would govern when it's morally acceptable to believe stuff and when it would be morally unacceptable to believe stuff, all right? Maybe there is no such general principle, all right? But we might make a little headway toward that. Now, what I'm going to do is give you an argument first to the effect that it is morally wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. And that's coming at us from W.K. Clifford. I think that's a William for the W. All right? way back there in 1879, right? And you see a principle that's somewhat similar to that coming from even earlier, from David Hume, whose birth was 400 years ago, right? This is the year to celebrate that, I think, all right? Back in 1748. In other words, everybody ought to be rational when it comes to believing stuff, right? And I hold my hands up, right, like that's supposed to convince everybody, okay? And it's, of course, up to you to say, all right, well, what's the argument anyway, right? People believe things for all kinds of reasons. You know, come on, it's a free country. Why can't we believe what we want, all right? What's the harm, after all, in believing that UFOs are visiting the Earth, right? As long as you don't, like, I don't know, give all your money to some sort of obscure museum in New Mexico or something like that, right? Similar things hold for religious beliefs too, and that is a target, anyway, of Clifford's paper, The Ethics of Belief. But if we talk about that in the question period, that's fine, and a couple of my examples have to do with that, but I'm after bigger fish. I'm after a general principle that governs anything and everything, right? When is it okay to believe stuff and when not, okay? Our scientists around, I'm glad some of them came, they already have a yes answer to that, right? You must always believe on the basis of sufficient empirical evidence and so forth. Otherwise, you'll get laughed out of the auditorium, right? You won't get anything published unless there's good evidence for it, right? Now, I wonder if the same holds in the regular population too for everyday life, right? Clifford says not. Now, let me see if I can get this to go. Now, they tell me I can point and go anywhere I want and it will move. There we are. So there's Clifford's argument, all right? The way I write arguments is like that. I usually like to number the premises, then you know what's being committed to and what the distinct premises are. The conclusion is at the bottom. And it goes like this. I mean, basically, I won't read it to you because I know everybody can read. We have a very basic moral principle first. You know, harm is bad, right? And then the second premise, number 2 there, it's like, okay, well, believing on the basis of insufficient evidence, well, that's something that can cause harm, all right? And it follows from that. Logically speaking, I believe number 3 would be guaranteed if number 1 and number 2 are true. Well, it's unethical to believe anything, right, on the basis of insufficient evidence, whatever that is, okay? And that's something we could quibble about, I'm sure. So philosophers like to say, what do you mean by that? And if this were 101, I would say, all right, ask some of those, what do you mean by that kinds of questions, right? And certainly what counts as sufficient evidence is going to be one of those things, right? What counts as having sufficient evidence for some belief, right? At the very least, what would certainly count is something if you had like a deductive proof, like in mathematics or something like that, right? That would certainly count, okay? I don't think we want to hold out for that as far as what sufficient evidence is. Otherwise, it's unethical to believe almost everything that we actually do believe, all right? So sufficient evidence probably means something a little bit less than full-on mathematical proof, right? So what would it be? Okay, let the scientists tell us, at the very least, something else that would count, right? All right, well, if you have the kind of evidence where whatever the evidence you have raises the probability of what you're believing sufficiently enough, all right, then okay, that counts. If you want me to give it to you in logic speak, well, there are deductive and inductive arguments. Inductive arguments try to claim, anyway, that their conclusions are supported but not guaranteed by their premises, right? And any argument that actually succeeds in that basic claim, well, that's a strong argument. So any strong argument, we'll say, counts as sufficient evidence too. Now, beyond that, controversy arises, I would imagine, right? And so I'm not going to say anything about that. Well, does a gut feeling count as sufficient evidence? Does mere wanting to believe something count as sufficient evidence? Does it sounding cool if you talk about it count as sufficient evidence? Does a lot of people in the audience raising cards count as sufficient evidence for it to be true? All right, next on the list, that's undue harm. I'll be fast on that one. That's only so, if you look at number 1, right, anything that may cause undue harm is unethical to do. I put in undue there to leave room for harming people where harm is appropriate, like self-defense or something like that. If you're into punishment as far as justice is concerned, Right? Some people are into punishment. Well, if you're into that, that involves harm, right? So that's harm that's due to those people. So we don't want to have that be in the mix. And then finally, the last item there, may cause, and that's where all of the fits will start, right? Because lots and lots of stuff may cause harm or even undue harm, right? So how strong must the may be, right? How strong must the probabilities involved here be? And that's where things get very messy, and I will just resort to sort of polling you at that point to sort of see where people lie, all right? Now, why am I polling, right? Because polling doesn't determine what the truth actually is unless we're just looking for attitudes and things, all right? We want to know what really counts as sufficient evidence and so forth, right? We want to know what the real moral principle is governing belief rather than just, what we might think is the right principle, okay? But I almost said I have faith, but that would be something I'm not sure about the sufficient evidence part, right? But I'll say it anyway. I have faith in one way or another, right? That human beings have some kind of moral fiber to them, where what you can do is we all have sort of a basic understanding of what's right and wrong in various circumstances, right? And in those kinds of circumstances, I can toy around with some of your moral intuitions and see what you think. And we might see some widespread agreement on some things. We might see widespread disagreement on some things. And that in itself can point us in the direction of a moral principle, maybe, okay? So, all right, that's that. Now, again, I'm tempted, since I do this in class, to say, all right, well, what do you think about that? All right. But instead, let's proceed this way. Now, I'm going to go through, there are about 5 different examples, but there's a whole bunch of permutations of each one. All right. Now, I've numbered them all. So it goes like up to 15 or something or other like that. So don't go screaming out of the room at the number of examples here. So what I'll do is I'll pitch a case to you. It violates all of the principles of PowerPoint. There's lots of text on it, right? Read it over fast and say, all right, well, the judgment is this, right? Raise your card. Is it ethical? Is that a case of a belief that's ethical or morally acceptable to have? Or was it morally unacceptable to have that belief? Okay? Everybody understand the little game that we're going to play? Good to go? All right. Well, can't play yet because I have to find it. All right, there we go. Oh, right. So what else is going on with the argument? I almost forgot about this, so I'm glad I have the slide. Is it just a matter of what harms the belief directly causes, or is it more complicated than that? Now, Clifford leaves discussion of this out for the most part, at least in the smallish paper that I usually assign in 101. But this picture here is, I hope anyway, a nice stab in the right direction at all of the other stuff that seems to be going on, right? There you are over there on the left with the belief in the middle, all right? Call that belief B, and then somehow or other, presumably you have some evidence for it. There it is. What then? All right, well, that belief at least has the possibility of causing some behavior, some actions on your part. It might be verbal behavior, it might be bodily behavior, it might be all kinds of things, all right? But at least has the potential to do that, all right? And then, of course, you could judge those actions that you do as right or wrong, fine. But if Clifford is talking about harms, right, not just to oneself, but to other people, and maybe to humanity at large in some sense or other, all right, then you want to look at what the consequences of those actions you do would be, all right? And, of course, those consequences can come in the form of being good or harmful, good or beneficial, or bad or harmful, right? And then you have those questions along the right that are operating here also, right? Because you could say, all right, well, some harms take place as a result of my having this belief, right? But it's not much of anything, right? It doesn't cause anything much more than a paper cut, say, to somebody, right? And what's the harm really in that in the big scheme of things, right? On the other hand, if the belief in question happens to result in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, all right, well, that's a much bigger deal, all right? Now, there are 4 places that you can focus on, I think, by way of figuring out whether the belief over there I'm calling B is ethical to have or not, all right? And it corresponds to different ways that I'll sort of wheel around with the cases, all right? And it goes like this, all right? There are the 4 of them. First, look far along the left there, all right? How well does that evidence support the belief? That's where Clifford says we're supposed to focus our attention, right? If the answer is that the evidence doesn't support the belief very well, especially if there's other evidence against it, then you ought not to believe it. Easy enough, all right? But there are other places to look too if we're wondering about the effect a belief has as far as causing harms down the road or something like that, either to yourself or to other people. Look at 2. I mean, lots of people believe things that are very unlikely to come out as far as their behavior is concerned, right? Suppose you have very serious and deeply held racist prejudices, right? Yet you live somewhere where those prejudices never get a chance to come out, right? There are communities like that around, right, that are homogenous in one way or another, okay? What about 3, right? Suppose you do some things, all right? Lots of things that we do will guarantee some good consequence, sure. Lots of things that people do might guarantee some harmful consequence. But an awful lot of things that people do aren't like that in any way at all. I mean, what happens in many cases is that you might do something, but there's only a probability that the beneficial stuff will take place, or there's only a probability that the harmful stuff will take place, right? Think of something where there's just a risk involved, right? Maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't happen, right? And then finally over there, number 4, and then we'll get to the cases and see what people think. Even if the bad stuff does happen, it could be the case that the bad stuff is insignificant in your moral calculation, right? Or it could be significant, right? And it also might matter who it actually is that's being harmed, too. Okay, so those are all things by way of complicating matters somewhat. And so now let's start actually with, I hope this is an easy case, but we'll see, all right? Clifford has this example right at the beginning of the paper that involves a ship. So I'll just let everybody read there. Now, in this case, we know what the outcome is. In other cases down the road, I'm going to leave the outcome unknown, because that happens too, right? You don't know exactly what's going to happen in the end, but you still have to make some kind of judgment anyway. All right, so there's this ship. It's a rickety old ship. I could have found a picture to stick it up there, but I didn't. Right? Imagine one. Well, it's worked, it's sailed all of these voyages, it's just fine, all right? But then the mechanics, or whoever it exactly is that works on the ship and tells people about these things, right? Say, well, no, you shouldn't do that because the ship isn't seaworthy. It might make it out of the harbor, but then it might bloop, 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 sink right away. Says, no, I will trust in Providence that we're going to be good to go. All right? So he does. Right? And then what happens if the ship sinks? What about the belief? All right? Now's your first try, all right? Was it wrong to have that belief? If so, hold up your red card. Or was it morally okay for him to have that belief in that case? All right? Very good. Good, good. Everyone must play. Good, good. All right. All right, this is exactly as I expect, right? Everybody's like, okay, universal red back there, right? Now try to report how it goes to the people in the front, all right? And by the way, the people in the front, don't let you guys determine how it goes in the back, right? Because the disadvantage here is you could be in the back, like back there by Roger, and you could just kind of wait. Oh yeah, I think that must be green right there. Okay? I see a question in the back already. Yeah, that's at least an objection to, whether you meant that as an objection or not, there's an objection hanging around there. It's not the belief that we're judging, it's the action that resulted from it, okay? This isn't my response, it's Clifford's, because he's up on this, right? He says, well, no, that doesn't really matter, because what really happened in that case is he's still guilty of believing something that he shouldn't have believed. It's just that if the ship happened not to sink, like that case, number 2, he's still guilty of having a belief that he ought not to have. He just wasn't found out in that particular case. Now, I don't know how that grabs you, right? Let's see how it grabs everybody else. I mean, and you too, of course. All right? Let it be that they made it. Oh, they made it. Trusting in Providence. Whether that had any effect or not, right? Leave that out of it. You know, was it acceptable for the owner there to have that belief and on those grounds? Red or green? Everyone must vote. Ooh, I see a scientist with a green. Okay, a smattering, a smackerel even of green. Okay, now again, I might say, keep in mind why you're going that way. All right. I might as well see if I can push your intuitions just a little bit, even right here. Consider drunk driving for a minute. Happily, fewer people do that now, right? That's true, right? Of course, I think like everybody else that it's bad to do, right? It is negligent to go around doing that. But if you think about it, the risk it's not like you are doomed if you get behind the wheel after you've had too many. An awful lot of people, right? Scary amounts of people. You see them out on New Year's Eve, right? Are driving when they ought not to, all right? Well, what if you believe that, oh yeah, I'll make it home again tonight. I'll just, whether I'm trusting in providence or I'm just sort of hopeful, right? Well, I'll just do it. Most people make it, right? Now, in a case where you make it, right, was the belief that you'll make it home safely again something that was morally acceptable to have? Right. Most people go that way. All right. Now, whether it has, I'm laughing because somebody flashed a red. Whether this has something to do with low risk but high harm or something like that, or high risk and high harm in the case of the ship here, that you can file away also. All right. So move on to so leave his ships out of it here. All right. Now this one with the cruise ship, I have a whole bunch of permutations of it, and then I'll switch to something else. But this one I want to vary the parameters several ways. Okay. I'll let you read that. All right, we're good. Everyone's heard of the wonderful norovirus, I take it, right? Always fun sort of experience on a cruise ship or anywhere else, right? One of the more popular gastrointestinal illnesses that are out there. All right, there it is. Something similar to Clifford's case, right? But we're not talking life and death in this case. We're talking, some enjoyable vomiting or something like that. Okay. What do you think there, right? So the owner ignores the concerns that, the health experts, right, the doctors or whoever the company has on call, right? He's warned, and he believes that we don't need to go around and sanitize the rails or anything like that. And this time we'll trust in providence again. And this will be the last time we'll trust in providence. What do you think there? Red or green? All right, universal red there. All right. What if we switch it? Whoops, hang on. So that's bad, right? Now, what could be going on in your mind, right? What could be going on is that you don't like the trusting in providence part. That's possible, all right? Or you could be going on the grounds of, well, look, the owner there is negligent in some sense, because even though there's a 50-50 chance of the outbreak taking place, he's still violating his basic moral responsibilities to the passengers and so on, right? And 50%, I mean, come on, that's a little bit too much risk for all those people paying a couple $1,000s to go on a trip are concerned, all right? What if I take the providence part out of it? I've tried to bold some things here, and it's exactly the same as before, only the owner believes what he does, right? Sanitation isn't necessary. This time on the grounds that the health officials sort of point out to him. Well, it is 50%, that's it. And if so, only half the passengers will get it, and so I'll roll the dice or something like that. And after all, if you're stepping onto that ship, it's only a 1 in 4 shot that you're going to get the norovirus infection, right? Yes? How much does it cost? Okay, so a sort of business ethics type of question, right? You could do the cost-benefit analysis and so on, and the cruise ship companies most likely do. Right? Well, how much does it really cost, right? And then you weigh that against rolling the dice with respect to the passengers and stock value and poor news coverage and all of the rest of that. And you do a little expected value calculation, so on, and you come up with the right decision that you're supposed to do, right? And then I guess the only thing I would just wonder about is how that's supposed to match up with the moral decision, right? Some will say, yep, that's all there is to it. Others will say, well, no, you have other moral responsibilities beyond that calculation that you have. Yes?
Do they know the 50% chance before they get on the ship?
No, they're totally ignorant. The people who are buying the tickets, they don't know. I guess, what would a reasonable consumer expect? There's at least a chance that something like this could happen. But is it a 50% chance? That's, probably not expecting that kind of risk.
I wasn't sure if they were
Yeah.
told prior.
What do you think there? Did we do the cards? All right, go ahead and do the cards. Morally acceptable or not? Okay, not, all right? So again, right, is it the odds of bad things happening, right? It should be lower than that before we'll accept the captain or whoever it is taking this particular risk. Or is it just the fact that the outbreak took place, right? Same thing, only no outbreak this time. Does this change your mind? Raise your, I said guilty or innocent hands, but all right, everybody's on board there now. Did I convince you with my drunk driving thing? It's like just little things like that I can come this way with me, come to the dark side, right? Or whatever. Okay, so that's case 5. A couple of more cruise shippy types of cases. Let's lower the probability a little bit. All right. So now, all right, only a 1 in 10 shot at an outbreak. But if they catch the 1 in 10, half the people are throwing up over the rail. All right. And again, right, we're not trusting in Providence. The owner says, okay, well, we won't sanitize, we won't do what's necessary. And look, the odds are only 10%, and we've had a good record here so far. How are we doing now? All right. All right, now I see a smattering of greens, okay? It's like it's going down, 1 in 10. And now if you're a passenger, right? Okay, it's 1 in 10, and then multiplied by the 50% chance, so that's what? 0.1 times 0.5, that's... What's that come to? This is my standing in front of a bunch of people and can't do basic math. 0.1 times 0.5, that's 0.05, right? So 0.5%. Is that right? 5%. All right, well, anyway, that's fine. You have 5%. right, out of 2,000 people, too. All right, so I won't do any more math. I'll let y'all do that. Okay, so that was the deal with that one, all right? Let's adjust it a little bit more, all right? One where it's even lower probability of something bad taking place and an even smaller percentage of, the people on the ship there, okay? And the rest of it is the same, I believe. Nobody dies, yes, no death here, all right? Which is generous because if I understand it right, there is at least the possibility in real life if there is such an outbreak of somebody dying. Is that right? People have. All right. Anyway, but in this case here, what do you think there? Is it morally acceptable for the owner to believe what was believed? All right. Now I don't see very much change. I see a mix, all right, with most red, all right, and a few greens. But it seems like the same greens that were for the other percentage, all right? So you think about why, I'm not scolding you, right? You might think about why you have that particular judgment here, all right? So low probability of not a whole lot horrendous happening, maybe that's okay. Now, this time leave the outcome unknown. We don't know. Now, maybe this won't change people's opinions or not, right? If you're thinking the outcome doesn't really matter, it's all about the evidence. Well, leave it all the same, right? Fairly low risk. Okay. Is it acceptable to have that belief or not? Go ahead. All right, the same as before, all right? I see those things are getting heavy. Some people are out there, oh, God, these pieces of paper are so heavy. No. Well, you must vote. You must, right? At least with your mind. Okay, that's, I think, the last one, all right? So let's switch to bombing some people and see what our reasoning might be here. So, all right. I might be able to say I don't know, but go ahead. Yeah.
10,000 people, we can assume a smattering of innocence and non-innocence.
Yeah, I guess assume a mix of, your standard sort of mix of innocence and non-innocence. If you were going to, drop some bombs on somebody where there was that number of casualties, right?
Is that our president?
This is one of those things where, is it 2006 or is it 2008? But like the criticism of religious belief and so on, criticism of political beliefs, I want to try to stay away from too. But yes, you can have an independent president if you're wondering, or if you'd like to think of yourself as the president, that could work too. All right, then that would take care of it. Well, what do you think there? I mean, here's a case where we have a low risk sort of situation. Right? It's only a 1% chance. All right, 99% chance that there's nothing to this story that the intelligent people are saying. Right, and they do even assign a probability to it. It's very, very low. Right, but the harm, if we catch the 1%, is extremely high, we should say. All right, so how does that affect, if at all, right, what you ought to believe if you're the president in that particular situation? All right, in that situation, was it acceptable? Right, and suppose it turned out that they actually did have the plan cooking, and they would have acted on it, and so the president's decision, even though it was the 1%, turned out to be correct in this case. Was it okay to believe in that situation? All right, interesting. So a no. From somebody else tell me, does it look, I'm seeing close to half, maybe slightly less than half, right? There are more no answers, right? You must answer, right?
Can you ask if bombing is the only option?
That's the way I'm trying to cook up the case. That's right. And that's a very, very good question. Because in all of these sort of ticking time bomb kinds of cases, right, a very common thing and correct thing, right, to say is like, okay, you're oversimplifying the situation. There are always other things to do. We could go look for some more intelligence and so on, and take the appropriate precautions. But I'm trying to say, all right, well, just imagine a case where that's not possible.
You make a distinction between the correct choice and the ethical choice. You're saying, was it okay to believe that?
Yes.
That was a good choice to make, instead of the outcome. It's not tied to the outcome at all.
Well, the last bit is partly what I'm wondering. Right? I'm wondering whether the outcome matters or not. I mean, suppose that you're a utilitarian about belief, right? Where what you ought to believe is that which makes people happiest, or generates the most well-being, or something like that over the long run, compared with the unhappiness or lack of well-being, whatever that is. All right. Then belief has nothing to do with the truth. It has to do only with what works as far as happiness is concerned. All right. And you see, that makes it completely outcome driven as far as what you ought to believe. All right. You could go that way, I guess. All right. Or if you go that way in this case, why this case, but not in other cases, right? Typically everybody was universal, right, as far as Clifford's ship case where the ship sank, right? No matter what the outcome was in that case, and we had death and destruction in that one too, all right? I mean, it wasn't us in that case, right? But there were, people died and so forth. So, that doesn't matter, right? That the person did the wrong thing by believing what he believed. So if the cases are supposed to be treated differently, I wonder what the difference is supposed to be, and that's where I don't exactly know. What if you switch the outcome there where, yes, it was all just in vain. I know those 10,000 people died in the other country because we bombed them, terribly sorry, but there wasn't anything, there wasn't anything coming back the other direction. There was not a nefarious plan to attack us with a nuclear weapon, right? What do you think there? Similar as before, right? I'm going to come back here and intimidate people who aren't answering. Let's see. Very good. Thank you. All right. Same set of questions as I had before, right? If the outcome doesn't matter this time, then okay. What does matter, right? And then Clifford's, he's dead, of course. He's whispering from the grave. See, it's all about just the evidence part, right? It's the evidence that determines whether believing something is morally right or not. Okay. One more. Consider the doomsday device, right? The doomsday device, right? Inspired from Dr. Strangelove, right? If that looks familiar to you, right? That somehow came to mind while I was preparing this, all right? An extremely low chance that the doomsday device not only exists, but their crazy premier, whoever that is, right, is about to use it on us. The only thing we can do is go drop some bombs on them. 100,000 people it's going to take this time, all right? Maybe it requires a nuclear attack on our part to prevent this, if it's true, all right? So there again, the president says, bombs away, we need to do this time, and leave the outcome unknown. Who knows, all right? Yeah, McCain.
When you say maybe orders of magnitude more if they attack us, couldn't they just use their doomsday device? So might this just provoke it and increase your percentage?
Suppose we take out the doomsday device, right? The doomsday device, let it be, like a ship, and the ship is the device, right? I don't know where I read this. It's like there's some sort of plan to have something like this, right? The ultimate in mutual assured destruction, all right? A whole ship that's just packed with plutonium, ready to go, okay? And ignite the atmosphere or some sort of insane type of plan, all right? You take out the ship, but then they have all their other weapons to come back at us. What do you think? Is it acceptable in that case, right? Low probability, yeah. But horrendous. Everybody dies everywhere. See lots of red. Go ahead, a few greens. Very good. A couple of greens in that situation. Okay. So if anybody switched for that one, and I saw a couple people switch, all right, then there is some point where this risk level and the amount of harm and all of that comes into the equation as far as what you ought to believe. All right? And so that's a case that goes beyond what Clifford was suggesting to us, right? That it's only about the evidence. Okay? How about this? All right? So no death and destruction, just back to regular everyday life now. It's nice again. All right? Everybody know what the preponderance of the evidence standard is? The normal standard in a court is the beyond a reasonable doubt standard. So the judge gives you these instructions. It's like, okay, you go back there in the jury room, you figure out whether the defendant is guilty or not, and your decision has to be that, okay, if you think the person's guilty, they're guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Not beyond any doubt, but beyond a reasonable doubt. Okay? There is a weaker standard of evidence that's applied in some cases, and it's called the preponderance of the evidence standard. And there it's like this, like, okay, you go back in the jury room there, or if you're deliberating in some other kind of disciplinary hearing or something or other like that, okay, do you think the person did it or not, based on what you got, right? Is it a 51% chance that he or she did it? Right? Does the preponderance of the evidence lean toward guilt or evidence or innocence? That's all you need. See how it's weaker? Right? Suppose you're in that circumstance. All right? There's somebody charged with jaywalking, right? Crossing against the light or in the middle of the street, right? Or in the middle of the block. All right? You have a little bit of evidence in favor of the person being guilty. The defendant declines to offer any evidence. I got nothing. All right? Well, isn't it that... Well, go ahead and clarify. Well, the evidence for the person jaywalking is on the one side. Is there any evidence that he's innocent? Saying nothing is there, right? Except just denying the charge, right? So you can take the person at his word or not, right? If you take him at his word, that's accepting the evidence on the other side. Well, it's one word against another person's word and supposed eyesight. Suppose instead that the defendant calls no witnesses, and the prosecution calls one witness who tells a story, all right, I saw the person jaywalking. Where I'm looking for, as far as this case is concerned, right? A case where you only have a little bit of evidence in favor of one side, in favor of guilt, but no evidence is being provided at all for innocence. Imagine the defendant just pleads the fifth or something like that, or says, I choose not to respond to this. I won't dignify any of this. And for whatever reason, right, decides not to defend himself. Okay. The prosecution has given evidence, the defense has not.
Well, but the defendant did deny the charge.
Well, he has to admit a plea, right? He pleads not guilty, right? And that's it. But then calls no witnesses, supplies no evidence to defend himself, or to try to undermine the eyesight of the other person. It is different than the 10,000 people dying, that's right. So we're looking at a case, right? Or at least all right, this is the case I get the F on, all right? I'm fishing around for a case where we don't have a whole lot of evidence, period, right? And the only evidence we seem to have is sort of weak and only points one way, all right? Is that enough, right, as far as the preponderance of the evidence and so on goes, I'm not quite saying to justify the belief, but to make it okay to believe that a guilty verdict is appropriate in that circumstance? What say you? Okay, a mix, all right? And we don't know, right? We don't know, right? It's not like we can look on high, right, and say, oh, yes, right, it was definitely guilty. All right. Now, I'm at the point in my presentation where I don't know what the next one is, so it's just as a mystery to me as it is to you. All right, let's see. Oh, yes, right. The fine back here was only $25, not much at stake, right? Raise the stakes to $250, all right? So more at stake, right? The fine is bigger, and again, the evidence one way or the other is weak, and in fact, it's only a little bit of weak evidence in one direction. Question, yeah?
It's better that 10 guilty men go free than one innocent man be found guilty.
Well, there is that principle that is thought to be true sometimes. That is the sort of American-style way of looking at it, right? Other countries, like at least I hear that the system in France is exactly the opposite, or at least was in the past, right? That we'd rather make our error on the other side, right? That we'd rather make sure that we get the guilty people. And yes, we're terribly sorry about the innocent ones, but there you go, right? I don't have a view one way or the other, as to which one of those is the more just system, right? But there are other options, that's all I would point out. All right, are we voting here? $250 for the fine this time. We good? All right, it didn't seem to change people's attitudes there, right? What if I jacked it up and made it, What if I made it $2,500?
Where are you jaywalking at?
I don't know, somewhere where it's expensive, right? Maybe they've had a terrible outbreak of jaywalking and people are just tired of it. All right? Okay. Is there any dollar amount that would affect things? That would be the deal there, right? Is there any way of harming someone that you can move up or down so that might influence your verdict in that particular case? All right? Whether the judge says to keep that in mind or not. Right? Okay. Two more to go. Now, what I'm hoping anyway to get at with this one is the notion that there might be some beliefs that are isolated in the sense that maybe they're unlikely to cause any kind of harm or benefit at all, but maybe people have them, right? So what's going on in a case like this? So I made the person a hermit, so there's no interaction with other people, right? So you don't really have to worry about any impacts on the greater population or anything like that. It's just him, all right? And if you don't like clucking it like a chicken at noon, stripping naked, you could think of something else, right? It could be anything, you know, just staring at the sunrise every morning and breathing in for 10 seconds and out for 10 seconds, right? Something like that, if you want to, all right? What's the harm after all? Okay, so there you go, all right? And the thing to keep in mind this time is that we do know, let's say, what the real situation is as far as the truth or falsity of that particular religious practice. If you even want to call it that, right? It doesn't do anything, okay? Your religion is false. It's all right. You don't have to do that at noon each day to save your soul, if you even have one, okay? Well, what do you think? Is it acceptable for him to do that? Would that be okay? A few greens? Woo, lots of green. Look at that. Okay? Even if his belief is false. Okay. I did see a few reds. So I'll bet you then that this won't change things at all. We just don't know. Let it be uncertain as to whether that particular practice does any good or not. All right? One final vote. We're at 15. Yeah, that's right. What do you think? Okay still? Not okay? Yes? No, let's say he doesn't know. Then everybody votes the same, right? What if he does? Yeah, I mean, you could say, well, no, I know this is false that I do. I just do it, you know, for what else am I going to do at noon each day? Right? Now, I think in this case, all right, one thing that you might think about is what the harms might be. Right? If you think that harms are the kinds of things to take seriously, or even potential harms are the kinds of things to take seriously, whether you're talking about an action and its results, or if you're talking about a belief and the possible results that would come from it, and then the possible results down the road to other things, then you might wonder what the harms are in this case. All right? Clifford has three categories, right? There's harms to oneself, harms to other people, and harms to humanity at large, where if you might wonder what the harms to humanity at large would be. Think of the harms to humanity if you spread around through the population some very bad ideas about how to go about believing things, right? You should be credulous, right? You could say, right? And the more people who are credulous, who believe on very little evidence, that tends to be infectious, it is said, right? And so more people take on that attitude, right? And it works the other way too if you have people trying to be reasoned, reflective types of people. Well, you know, think of Socrates, right? People try to imitate that style too, all right? So you can have harms and benefits to society based on how you go about believing things, right? I don't know if there's those kinds of harms here, right? Are there harms to the hermit there? I don't know. Okay, so those are the cases. And all I'll do now is, how's my time? All right, this is about exactly right. This just summarizes some things. I won't read them out to you, except just to point out to you that, well, look, as far as risk and harm goes, at the very least, those first two cases, right, that was high risk of high harm, and then you can change things around down to low risk of low harm there for some of those cruise ship cases, right, where the chances of an outbreak was very low, and even if you caught that low percentage, there wouldn't be that many people getting sick anyway, right? How did that affect things, if at all? All right, and then these other cases, there was the bombing case, all right, again, they're sorted out in terms of risks and harms if your luck is good or bad, right? And there it is, right? And then a question mark there at the very bottom right because, you know, are there any harms as far as the way the hermit goes about coming to believe what he believes. So I'll just leave that for you. All right, so there's the argument, Clifford's argument again. I was fishing around at least for some cases that might undermine one or another of the premises, right? Cases where, okay, maybe the evidence isn't so good, but is it ethical to believe it anyway? All right, like the doomsday device case, right? I think would be a nice one for that. All right, suppose the conclusion is true, right? How are we supposed to act? What should we give up? And then finally, my question that I hope maybe somebody will tell me, right, because I don't know the answer, right? Is there any one moral rule, if there is one, right? Maybe it's Clifford's, I don't know, that governs proportioning one's belief to the evidence, right? That's the Hume quotation from the very beginning, right? Is there such a principle that gets at some more detail or not? Okay, that's it for me. Thank you very much. And I guess we'll have questions now, is that right? Okay. Thank you.
Well, I'm one of the people that was resistant after the first one to vote. And the reason I was resistant to vote is because it always seemed to be a case of weighing different beliefs against each other and sort of making a determination about action. And this might touch on what John was mentioning too. Making a determination of action, decision to act, based on one belief versus another belief, and sort of weighing the possibilities of what's going to occur versus not going to occur. So that the hermit case, again, and maybe, I hope I'm not missing something really central at some point, but it seems like the hermit is thinking, there's no damage here. I had a conversation with someone who claimed to be able to communicate with my dog. And I'm not sure that I really believed what was going on, but it was kind of, why not? There's no harm, I thought, in holding the belief itself. And in fact, the actions that I took based on the quasi-belief, let's say, non-endorsed thought, seemed positive. So, I did some things that she recommended, and yes, things turned out nicely. So I don't, that didn't strengthen my belief. I have to say, I'm not sure about it. But anyway, so I think I was resistant because it seemed like there was a crucial step in the middle, having to do with deciding what belief to act on, how to choose competing beliefs. So it just seems to be sitting there alone wouldn't determine, I'm assuming that's not the assumption, that the belief is deterministic always of an action, right? So.
Yeah, and I didn't have a case that tried to get at that, right? Where you might have a belief, and then okay, there's only some likelihood that some action will result from it, right?
That's kind of built into some of these cases, and it seemed like an omission, maybe deliberate omission, that the stage between I believe X.
Yeah. Well, the one about the president deciding to drop the bombs or not, right? That was one where, okay, once the belief is arrived at, the order flows right straight from that, right?
Well, no, I don't see that from a belief, an order follows straight from a belief.
Well, that's what I was building into the case, anyway.
Well, I'm more concerned about the decision-making process, right?
Yeah, and I think that part is something that's the correct comment, or a correct comment to make about some of these cases, right? For the owner of the cruise ship, say, all right, where the probability is low of the disease outbreak, all right? Did the owner really believe that there won't be an outbreak on the basis of the evidence that it's unlikely, right? I mean, that wouldn't have to be the belief that the owner came to, right? You could say, well, no, I don't really believe one way or the other, which, whether there's going to be a disease outbreak or not. But what I do believe is that there is a risk, and I'm obligated to act in this case to eliminate that risk, right? And so you could say, all right, well, we'll sanitize, right? Or you could say, well, I don't think the risk is high enough. Therefore, we won't bother with sanitizing. But at no point in the decision-making process was there a belief that there will not be an outbreak. Similarly, right, remember, if you remember during the run-up to the invasion of Iraq, there were arguments made that were similar to some of these, right? It's like, okay, well, there is this risk of Saddam Hussein having nuclear weapons already and so on, right? He has reconstituted his weapons program and so forth, right? And then you could imagine on Meet the Press or one of those Sunday morning talk shows, somebody would ask Vice President Cheney, it's like, okay, do you believe that Saddam Hussein has nuclear weapons right now, right? Now, he could have just said, yes, I do. That's why we're invading. Right? But he didn't have to say that. He could have said, well, what I believe is keeping America safe. That would be like the political thing to say, right? But even though it's political, it could be what's a crucial part of his decision-making process. And the same for President Bush, too. It's like, well, I don't believe one way or the other that he has them, but I believe there is a risk there that we're justified in acting upon. And see, then again, you wouldn't have to have believed that he has nuclear weapons or a program or anything like that, or disbelieved that he did. I think that's what you're getting at with at least that first comment. Now, the other comment about whether there are beliefs that have any kind of harms that are associated with them or not, right? Are there any beliefs, what's the harm in having that anyway? Well, I have a view on that, but I don't want to give it right now.
At one point, it's not justified, but it's okay. So I'm not sure what seems to be.
Yes, those are different, right?
What distinction are you drawing?
Yeah, well, is it ever morally acceptable to believe something that you're epistemologically unjustified believe? You don't have good evidence for. Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
Maybe it's just the time will tell.
Well, I almost tried to build a case to have up there in lights for you around something like that. But certainly, there are a number of views about that. You could say, all right, well, pick your favorite ancient culture that believed the world was flat. Were they justified in believing that? It's like, okay, I mean, given the sort of evidence that was available at the time, looks flat to me, right? So weren't they justified? Okay, you'd be tempted to say yes, right? They didn't have access to the other stuff, right? Or if they did, no one had figured out exactly how to best discover that information and so on. All right. Now, if you put us in that situation, right, do you think the world is flat or not? And you say that it is because it looks that way, then you're probably going astray because you have all kinds of other evidence available to you. Just ask some of the people here in this room, and they'll explain very clearly to you why it's the other way and what evidence you could seek out for that. Right? As far as the vaccination case goes, it's a sort of tricky question early on in some kind of set of questions about an issue, right? It's like, okay, do vaccinations cause these kinds of ailments in children and so forth, right? And then maybe there's some anecdotal evidence out there, which the scientists and medical professionals will discount right away because anecdotal evidence on its own is no good, all right? But nevertheless, it does convince people, right? And so you say, all right, well, what would it be morally acceptable to believe? You could withhold judgment. You could say, all right, well, let's be careful or something or other like that, at least at that point. My own understanding of that, and so here I'll profess, right? My own understanding of that issue is that that's been decided. There have been a number of studies to the contrary that there's no correlation at all. And so now if you're in the situation, now suppose that that's all accurate, right? that the worry has been answered and there isn't anything to worry about, right? Yet someone stubbornly hangs on to the original belief in face of the contrary evidence. That looks like believing something on insufficient evidence now, because you haven't really believed on insufficient evidence. You've suppressed the evidence to the contrary or something like that. Yeah, is trying to be safe where possible a virtue? Is being negligent a vice? So there you have a virtue and a vice. That if that's fundamental, if you're into that or using that language, whether you think it's fundamental or not, I would imagine at least the analysis of some of these cases proceeding similarly. Was the ship captain in Clifford's case where the ship sank? Is that a case of negligence or not? Now you might say, right, and it's just what's coming to mind right now, it's like, okay, well, what is negligence anyway? Like, okay, well, it's ignoring risk where evidence for it is already there. And so then you're back to making some kind of risk analysis, right? So, I mean, I think you can translate into the other, at least into that one.
What about if it's due?
What if one believes that it's due harm is the question. So what, a case where you're negligent on purpose because it's all right, they're due anyway?
Say death penalty.
Yeah.
Say that if a man has killed 10 people, is convicted and is due to die of lethal injection, would that come into this?
Okay, so the question is, all right, what if you're deciding a death penalty or a capital crime kind of case, all right? I mean, what the belief is that you're wondering about whether to have or not is whether to punish this person in this way, right? Where in the end it's sort of like, okay, well, if we do this, would that person be due, right? That's just another way of asking whether that person is guilty or not, I would think, all right? So you could have some reasoning out there about whether or not to harm somebody or not, whether that harm is just or not. And then again, it would be the same basic kind of position to consider, right? Whether it's the right position or not, right? Is it ethical to believe that that person committed that crime based on that evidence that you have in front of you, right? Or is it ethical to believe that capital punishment is acceptable in any case or something like that, right? Those would all fit in this, even though it's admittedly slightly more complicated because you're talking about a belief having to do with harming somebody or not, right? Yeah, John.
Let me suggest that we give Dennis another big round of applause for a very thought-provoking conversation. And everybody who can stay and talk, we can continue to stay and talk, have more tea and cookies, but I know some people, are counting on Claudia's good tradition of getting things wrapped up. So if anybody needs to leave, please do. If anybody wants tea and cookies, get it. And if John and whoever wants to ask a question and Dennis is willing to answer, Terry.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
So I take it that part of what you were saying is that you're not sure about your intuitions of a lot of this. I'm also not sure about some of my intuitions, but I think if I pitch it, a couple of my intuitions, maybe we can tease something out.
Okay.
So I have the intuition that the ship captain was not justified in believing that it was okay not to. But I have the intuition that the president was justified in believing that it was okay wrong, but I
Yeah, okay. Because there's that passage in the Clifford article where what he would say to you, perhaps incorrectly, is, oh, well, you can't divorce the belief from the action that comes from it, right? And it's true, like you say, that, okay, actions might come from one belief that you have, but there are usually many, many, many more of them, right?
Right. So what's interesting to me is I want to say for when belief does not lead to actions, you can believe whatever. I don't care whatsoever. So set those cases aside. So now we're looking at when belief can lead to action. It still doesn't necessarily lead to action, and the president may believe that something is necessary and yet still not do it. There are times when I felt, I know that's a little peculiar, but I think there are times when I felt it's necessary to do this, but I'm not going to do it for other reasons. And I know that might be a little weird, but is it incomprehensible?
No, it's not incomprehensible, but in the doomsday device case, it would take ascribing a very unusual belief to the president.
I want to be clear that I'm not talking about the doomsday device. I want to talk about a smaller consequence.
Right. Okay. So take just the bombing, in order to take out the nuclear weapons program or something like that. So the belief is, okay, I believe we ought to do it, but we're not going to do it.
Yeah, and the reason we're not going to do it is, well, again, the reason this is because he's got, or she has a particular view about
About bombing, you could say. It's like, well, no, no matter what, we're just not going to be bombing anybody else. Sorry.
Something
Yeah.
peculiar, like every fight they want to say, "Gosh, I've got to do this," but because of something else, I'm not going to.
Yeah.
So I wonder if that says something that such is not the case with the ship captain in my perception. Because sorry, maybe I'm gonna lose it here. Okay, originally what I was what was driving me was that so a president has a responsibility to protect. Ship captain has a responsibility to protect as well. So it takes a very small percentage for a president to believe. Like
Yeah.
1%, and he might believe it's necessary.
Yeah. As long as the potential harms are high enough, right?
But maybe 2%, 5% is what it takes to do. So here's a case where I think believing and acting separate. So I have higher bounds for actually undertaking violent action. But than I do for the belief that violent action is necessary. Is that so? I guess that's sort of what I was thinking in the president's case. And so I think there's a weird relationship here between the efficacy of beliefs.
Yeah.
And,
I see. Well, no, I see what you're trying to get at, and all I'll say is that I see that, but I'm not entirely sure how to say what principle is going on in that kind of case. Yeah.
So let me take number 3 and let me change a word, and I want to get your opinion on this. So if I change the word unethical to useful, is it useful to believe on the basis of insufficient evidence?
Yes, it could.
And there are some people,
Say you're.
in sociobiology where people think humans are basically belief machines. In other words, we move to belief quite easily and naturally because it's useful. In other words, we don't have to go collect evidence on everything we make up our minds on. We just believe certain things, and that's what we do best.
Yeah.
Do you believe that?
There are some cases like that. We'll take like the law of small numbers, which is false, right? That nevertheless can be very useful in some circumstances, right? It's like, well, I've only seen 3 people walk out on that frozen pond and they all fell in. But it's the law of large numbers that's the correct one, right? And I picked that one because human beings, at least there seems to be some evidence that we're wired to not take enough of a sample size into account when we generalize, right? That seems to be just sort of how we are. But then the question is, well, why are we like that? What's the evolutionary explanation? It could be useful to make a decision quickly on the basis of
People form beliefs sometimes on very, very insufficient evidence. In
yes.
other words, just the argument of a persuasive personality will make people suddenly believe everything they say.
Yeah, and that's the kind of case that you construct, right? Where you say, all right, well, if it's useful as far as your life is concerned to obey the law of small numbers in that circumstance, you say, right? Then okay, was it ethical to have believed that whatever it is, right? Does the answer come out? Yes, I don't know. All right. Yes, it could be. It could be. Could be. Yeah, I need to think of some other kinds of cases that are like that. Yeah.
I like the connection to action. It makes the decision a little bit more pronounced, but it worries me a little bit because even if someone supposedly doesn't act on that unethical belief, that bad belief, whatever you describe it as, it's hard for me to imagine a circumstance where it doesn't have effect.
Yes. Some effect, yeah.
Their lack of action on a different event or the influence of that belief on other events is going to produce results, maybe indirectly.
Yes.
So I don't know how to, I like the connection to action because it makes for a better example. It's easier for me to split the hairs between what's good and bad, no matter what the percentage is. But just like he was saying, if they never act on it, I don't care. I can't conceive of a situation where they don't act on it directly or indirectly if it's a false belief.
Yeah.
It's going to have an effect, I guess.
Yeah. Take the hermit case. You know, what's the harm in believing that? Well, here's at least a possible harm. It's like, all right, well, maybe there's no harm in his clucking like a chicken at noon. Okay, that's fine. He gets some sun and so forth. But the manner in which he came to have that belief and maintains it breeds credulity as far as other kinds of things are concerned. So it might not hurt him to cluck like a chicken at noon, but repeating this kind of thought process and so forth raises the chances that it will be applied in a circumstance where there actually will be some harm that takes place, one might say. You know, say you're very willing to believe stuff. All right, it hasn't hurt you yet. Odds are is it'll hurt you sometime. Yeah.
What difference does it make that Rick Perry doesn't believe in global warming?
What difference does it make?
Is that a, or climate change, or, how do you, how is that unethical? Is that?
Well, if you take a person who's not in the running to be president of the United States or something like that, just a regular old person like me, and let it be that I keep the opinion to myself and I don't broadcast it to my students all the time. I might be more like the hermit. Okay, well, I have a belief that's not going to cause any harm. But if you're a person who leads the executive branch of the U.S. government and you're in a position to appoint people to the EPA and make policy and propose legislation and veto legislation and so on that's coming from the Congress, if you have your beliefs, if you have some false beliefs, those can have very real effects on lots and lots of things. Would be the answer, right? If I understood the question right? The question was, what's the harm in Rick Perry believing that global warming doesn't exist? Or let's say human-caused global warming, right? That's the issue. I would say very great harms are at least possible, right? And see, I can say that without saying, okay, I think he's right or I think he's wrong. Very great harms are at least possible given the office that he's running for.
But I think there's an answer to John's question, right? You don't talk about global warming, say,
Right.
Let's suppose you
Except,
don't,
I just did, right? Something.
but let's suppose you don't even vote. Here's a case where I think if he believes something, it's not going to have much of an effect. So
Can I ask a fast thing about your question? Because there was another question that maybe you were getting at, and you could say, all right, well, is there any harm ever in the not having of a belief about something? Because like there's two ways to not believe, that there's a God or that global warming is happening or whatever. You could either believe the opposite, right? Believe the negation of that. Or you could be suspending judgment. You could not have your mind made up. Or you could think the evidence truly pulls us in both directions, and so I'm going to wait as far as that's concerned. And then your question would be something like, okay, well, is the not believing something ever possibly harmful? It's a little more complicated, but I think the answer would still be yes in a great many cases, right? It's like if there's a lion coming at me and I say, well, I'm not sure, I hallucinated yesterday that there was one, I don't know, maybe I better suspend belief, maybe I better, check the video record or something like that, and, that's it.
And it's somewhat related to the cruise ship, for me, anyway. Even if there's not evidence that we are causing global warming and the world is going to be drastically and adversely affected by it. And even if the cruise ship doesn't cause lots of pain and sickness and death, cleaning it up is good. Cleaning up the things that are causing possibly global warming is good. That seems to be a more ethical decision for me to make.
Yeah, it is the type of case where you're talking about risks of, various levels of harm and so on, all the way up to catastrophic ones and so on, right? And then it's okay, well,
Concern is economics. It costs too much to clean it up, it costs too much to
yeah,
change our mind.
yeah, that's part of the equation too. Yeah.
And this just may be a question that is inadequate to the task, but if you go back to your graphic, which on this thing, which have the actions, the negative and positive actions, and I'm just trying to frame how a philosopher thinks about that. So the question is, and I'm asking this not rhetorically, but I'm interested, in order to frame this discussion in your head as a philosopher, to what extent is it imperative that you move past that first circle? So that if your focus is, and I'm trying to understand it, if your focus is asking questions about what constitutes morally acceptable beliefs, can you pursue that meaningfully without moving past that circle?
Into other actions. Yeah.
Because your framing of all of this in my head is, I got to talk about consequences in order to ask the question about morally acceptable beliefs.
Yeah.
And is that part of the contingent nature of this? Is that assumption contingent for making this discussion happen?
Well, I mean, no, because there have been some nice remarks made, even in your vicinity there, about beliefs that don't seem to have any causal effects on anything, on any actions at all. It's just you just kind of have them, and those. I would like to see some examples of ones that are supposed to be that way, but then there's. John behind you was asking about the hermit case. That was supposed to be something closer, not closest, but closer to a case where it's like, okay, here's a belief that doesn't seem to be doing it a whole lot, so that would be potentially harmful. And maybe you think about it a little bit, okay, maybe it does. If you're wondering about, and something else occurred to me, and maybe this is off topic or it's not getting to what you're trying to ask. One thing that's not good about that about that diagram up there is that various things that go through your mind also could count as actions. You know, suppose that you have a belief, and then that belief causes you to think about other things that you wouldn't have thought about otherwise, right? But that's not like a bodily action, right? But it's nevertheless a something, right? It is a mental act to think about something as a result of some stuff that you believe, right? I mean, and that happens all the time. It's like, well, I believe these two things. I wonder if they're logically consistent. Let me think them over, right? Well, that sort of deliberation wouldn't happen if I didn't have those beliefs, right? So one thing that's you know, if I really wanted to make it more accurate, it's like, okay, well, there's, you know, what about your thoughts, too?
So, and that seems also a consequence of framing around consequences. And I guess what I was trying to get at is, can you ask questions about what constitutes morally acceptable beliefs without having to pin it to questions of consequences and actions?
Yes, you could. You could pin it to logical consequences instead of bodily consequences. If you know Immanuel Kant's ethical theory, he's, you know, probably the best example of someone who's not a consequentialist as far as ethics goes. It's not about consequences with respect to pleasure in the absence of pain, but logical consequences certainly do count, right? Logical consistency, right? Namely, consistency of whatever maxim is guiding your action with the moral law itself, right? Which says what the nature of morality is. That's the most fundamental thing that one should be thinking about as far as ethics is concerned, right? But it's not a matter of weighing the consequences with respect to pleasure and pain. It's about seeing logical consistency between the principles that guide you and the principle that's supposed to say what morality itself is all about. Does that help at all?
Pinning it to action just makes it visible. Like adding a stamp to a slide. You're trying to see the consequence. Whereas those other things you talk about having inside someone's head are hard to revisit.
Yeah.
How do you know that it was good or bad?
Yeah, it wouldn't come out directly. But, you know, suppose you have some beliefs that wind up causing some other thoughts that maybe you wouldn't have had otherwise. Well, maybe those thoughts cause you to do some things that you wouldn't have ordinarily done. Maybe those kinds of actions, you know, would not have been good to raise the likelihood of your doing or something like that. And so then you're back to the original belief. It's like, well, should you really have had that? Or what?
Don't you end up in a problematic, as it seems to me, people continuously throw variations on the conditions to you to see how you respond. At the end of that, if you're good at fending off the variations in the setups, have you reached closer to the goal of articulating morally defensible belief holding?
Yeah, that's what we want in the end, right? Whatever the principle is, it'll ideally handle the sober intuitions about what's right and wrong, and answer, you know, and then divide things in just the right way that maybe on independent grounds we think is how it's supposed to be divided, right? That would be the goal, of course, and that's why you play with imaginative examples like these, whether they're likely to ever happen or not. It's not an empirical test; it's a conceptual test of some proposition. See what, you know, is this sensible or not?
There's a thought experiment that might help with, I think, a point that Jim's making. I could be mistaken. It's out there. Alien world. Aliens, they have very active mental lives. But that's it. And it's conceivable that these weird creatures might still come to disapprove of their own thoughts. Cultural, I'm saying, let's not talk about morality per se, let's just talk about specifically cultural beliefs. I can imagine a race of beings coming to think that one should not think certain things, even though, by definition, it's impossible for them to actually amount to anything. So it certainly seems conceivable to me that we can that we can have this without any context.